All right. Um, Everybody, welcome back to the Leah McSweeney show. This is a little different because there's crazy shit going on right now. And I have Moshe with me, who is an amazing independent journalist who I started following years ago. He's incredible. I feel like if I'm going to talk about the Middle Eastern conflict right now, there's no one better to talk about it than you. So welcome and thank
Well,
you.
I appreciate it. Leah, I feel like the first time we connected on Instagram was actually the last Middle East conflict back in May of 2021. Could that
Wow.
be right? Could we have
I
come full circle here?
think so. I thought it was like COVID stuff that I
Oh,
started.
it could have been COVID as well. Yeah.
That was also COVID. And then we met in the Hamptons at the artists and writers softball game. And I guess maybe it was. Yeah, I guess it was during that
Well,
time.
I remember because somebody said to me during the conflict, they're like, Leah McSweeney just endorsed you. I go, what do you mean? And I went to your page, and then I think you had like something like very blunt about like FCNN, F Fox News. Listen to this guy.
Yeah, because look, I like most people, a lot of people, in our country are like, I want to look for independent journalism that is not like being like controlled by like advertisers and like this crazy click. I honestly think that part of the reason like our society is so effed right now, fuck,
hmm
it's my podcast, is is because of like CNN and Fox and like this like clickbaity extremism, and it's just like we're
Yeah,
polarized.
I think we're put in a really tough position right now by the media. Everything is sometimes literally is put in black and white terms, and there's many shades of gray, and that is not covered effectively. And the two sides have gone further to their side. There's lack of a real dialogue. No one's listening to each other. And by the way, when you turn on the media, do you know what gets ratings? People saying crazy stuff. Do you know what doesn't get ratings? Somebody saying kumbaya, let's get together and have a real dialogue and compromise. No one wants to watch that. They want to see someone saying something crazy. And that's what cable news, I started my career, Leah. My first job was at Fox News Channel 20 years ago. So I got a really, front row seat to what cable news realized was going to get people to stay. And here's a fun statistic for you. And this has continued at Fox, when I was there, and I left, more than 10 years ago, the average viewer watched 4 hours a day of Fox News. The average viewer of CNN watches 11 minutes a day. Why? What's the difference? One network is constantly reinforcing certain opinions, and one for a long time, this is pre-Trump era, CNN was just like, here's some stuff that's happening. This is interesting. This is not interesting. Let's move on to some other stuff. And people are like, okay, I got my fill. I'll move on. Whereas MSNBC learned the lesson from Fox as well. And they're like, if we continue to feed stuff that either makes you angry or you agree with, you tend to stay longer. If you stay longer, you watch the ads. If you watch the ads, I can charge more for the ads. Get it?
And CNN jumped on that too.
Correct. And then the Trump era, CNN became MSNBC2 because they're like, we want people to stick around longer. Like, let's, make this about Trump. Even after Trump is president, you would be like remiss if you didn't go to CNN or MSNBC and they weren't still talking about Trump, right? Because they knew that their viewers like want to know the latest and want to be angered. And by the way, it's not cable news alone. Social media is the same way. Facebook, what did they realize in the algorithm? Stuff that makes you angry keeps you around.
Oh my God, we're so screwed. It's really and then people he won because he's saying things that are making people angry and he's saying crazy things.
Listen, I think that he also tapped into a distrust that people have, some fairly, some unfairly, into our larger systems. Like if you look at the last 20 years of American history, go to 9/11, go to the war in Iraq, go to the financial crisis of 08, 09, the collapse. Over the last 20 years, we have fundamentally lost trust in things we took for granted. The CIA, the FBI, the CDC, the Supreme Court. You can go one by one. These are institutions that hold up our nation. And when you poll today versus 20 years ago, the amount of people who don't trust those institutions has skyrocketed. Well, there are politicians who are going to reinforce those opinions. But what does that do to a society? What does that do to democracy? And I don't want to get too philosophical here, but there are larger questions we need to ask about all that.
Well, I, for one, think that our society is so fractured that there's people ripping down posters of innocent Israeli hostages and like it's acceptable. And
Yeah,
like,
we've seen that video from across the country, right? So Leah, what you're talking about is um, Jews and various groups here that are trying to raise awareness about, as we speak, there's 203 hostages being held against their will. That includes infants, that includes the elderly, that includes the disabled in the Gaza Strip. So across the U.S., people have decided to put up posters saying, here's a picture of somebody who's been kidnapped. They're 4 years old. They're 9 months old. We have gotten to the point where things are so divisive, we've completely lost empathy that Palestinian activists are ripping down posters of kidnapped civilians because it doesn't reinforce their cause.
how does that help
It,
Palestinians at all? Like, how is that you helping make your point? It's just so, yeah, to me, like, that is like, I'm like, where is the like humanity? Like,
where is the humanity? Like the basic humanity. And this wasn't always this way. Like it wasn't that long ago that like we could come together and be like, while we disagree on the solution to the conflict, but we agree that there needs to be a solution. We're talking about an area the size of New Jersey. It has 15 million people in it. 7 to 8 million are Jews. 7 to 8 million are Palestinian, Arab, Christians, or Muslims. Somehow you have to split the state of New Jersey into two. Now we can all agree that there needs to be some sort of solution for both countries. They both need to have countries, but we might disagree on what those final borders may. We might disagree on the specifics. But can we agree that terrorists going and burning bodies and kidnapping people is not a way to get there? And I think we used to be able to say that, but things have gotten so divisive that now people are sympathizing with terrorism.
Exactly. That's like what it comes down to for me. And it's like, yeah, this is such a like nuanced and like very complicated, like historical issue.
Yeah.
But just in simplified terms, you don't need to know anything to know that like that is really bad. Those people are bad.
Mm-hmm.
Like against everything that I thought we stood for here. Yeah, like
I think that unfortunately this conflict is so long running. The hatred has gotten so deep seated and multi generational. And if you look at the conflict in the past 15, 16 years, Leah, we were in a stage, we're old enough to remember that there were active peace talks happening in the 90s and the early 2000s.
definitely attention to any of that back then, but like, but I'm sure that happened.
It happened. There were White House ceremony. You had Yasser Arafat, who represented the Palestinians. Yitzhak Rabin was the prime minister of Israel. Bill Clinton was with them. They were working on final stage negotiations on how to create a permanent peace agreement, a split of the land, an end to decades of conflict. They got very, very close multiple times, most recently during the Bush administration. Okay. But since 2007, it's all fallen apart. There have been no active talks. Hamas took over the Gaza Strip, an active terrorist group that seeks the death of all Jews. And by the way, all Christians at some point too, if you read their charter.
Like a lot of people.
Like basically a lot of people. They're very in line with Al-Qaeda, with ISIS. It's all a general Islamist philosophy that there needs to be a religious regime and Islam is the only way. Okay. They have short-term objectives and long-term objectives. The issue we have, especially in the region and everyone observing it, is for 16 years, they've seen no real compromise, no real resolution. And so you've gotten a steady diet of, they're the devil, they're the devil, they're the devil, they're the devil. And so now we're like, almost 20 years into like no real talks. And so I think it's hard to see the forest for the trees. It's hard to see where there's a solution here. So people are doubling down on their side.
Is it possible that, because what these terrorists did to these Israeli citizens was the most brutal. And I watched the towers fall down, which was very traumatic. That was like a pivotal moment in my life. But the images that I saw last Saturday, and the things I read about and the videos and everything, I've never heard of anything so barbaric or like read about anything except maybe for the like I don't know, like what
ISIS. I mean, ISIS was doing similar stuff, right?
ISIS was beheading journalists, and yes, but they were like, it's still like, okay, that's disgusting and horrible, but like these are babies, these are
Yes.
families, these are not journalists. Either journalists obviously shouldn't, but these are people who are like staying out of things, right?
Right.
Like they're not
Right.
like they're not soldiers, they're not journalists, they're not anything. They're
No,
just
250 plus of them were at a concert.
regular ass people, right? Exactly, at a concert. Is it possible that Hamas did this so brutally because they knew Israel would be in a position where they have to attack, and then their civilians are going to die, and then the rest of the Middle East is going to have a reason to kind of fight back? Like, I'm just like, this is where my simple
all right, so let's talk about the characters in this plot, shall we? In one corner, you have the Hamas terror group. They formed in the 1980s. They have a very religious, philosophy that entire piece of land should be Islamist territory. There should be no Jews there, and they grew in strength. They're one of the first groups that really made suicide bombing a thing. So terror groups, actually, the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, that became the Palestinian Authority, they began terrorism in the 60s and 70s. That included the Munich massacre at the Olympic Games in '72. That included hijacking planes. They were engaged in that.
Okay, and were they doing all of this because of this land?
Yes. So actually, let's rewind.
Okay.
Because we could rewind several millennia, but let's rewind to 1948, okay, where the modern conflict really begins here. So the British, for 400 years, the Turks occupied the land. During World War I, the British take it over. The British, controlled most of the globe for a while. They had India, they had Pakistan, they had half of Africa. They had parts of the Middle East. The French and the Brits split up the land. The French get what becomes Syria and Lebanon. The Brits get Jordan and what will become Israel, Palestine. The Brits are there between 1918 and 1948. World War II comes around. We know about World War II. The Brits are like, you know what? We don't have time for this stuff anymore. We got to get out. Like, we just fought this crazy war. We have to rebuild our country. We are done with colonialism. We've had a couple hundred years doing it. We're cool. You two, let's figure out a solution for you. So the Brits are like, listen, there's a bunch of Jews who live here. There's a bunch of Arabs who live here. Let's figure out a split of the land because you guys don't get along. There are a whole bunch of riots, conflict, etc. At the time, in the 1930s, sorry.
The riots and the conflicts between the Arabs and Jews at that time, religious differences or?
Well, it was, it was religious differences. I mean, keep in mind, the Mufti of Jerusalem, the leader of the Palestinians at that time, actually had several meetings with Hitler. Like, he was into like what the Nazis were up. He's like, can you take care of the Jews here too? By the way, the Nazis were stopped in Egypt. They almost made it to the Holy Land. Thankfully, that's where the Allies basically stopped them and then pushed them out of North Africa. But yeah, it was a religious conflict. Now, you could say for centuries, going way back, the Jews and the Muslims in that part of the world lived, relatively peacefully, but there's always race riots and Jews were second-class citizens in that regime. But let's fast forward to the 20th century. So there's a conflict over religion and who's controlling the land, etc. The issue for the Arabs on that land, who would become known as the Palestinians, the Jews shouldn't be here. We need to control everything. This idea that the Brits are going to give them any piece of land, not acceptable to us. Okay. This is Muslim Holy Land. And this is one of the issues we face, Leah, for those who aren't familiar. In the land that's the size of New Jersey, there's an area the size of DC or smaller, like literally a neighborhood, where literally we believe Abraham, circumcised Isaac. Ishmael was there. Moses brought the people there. Jesus was walking around there. Later, Muhammad rises to heaven from there. So literally, when we talk about like the Temple Mount, 1 kilometer, 1 square kilometer, I mean, you and I could walk around there, the entire complex, in about 10 minutes. That is where the Jewish holy temples were twice and were destroyed, where the 10 Commandments were stored.
In Jerusalem?
In Jerusalem, the Temple Mount, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the Temple Mount, not even the city of Jerusalem, one little piece of land is where the temples were, and Muhammad rose to heaven. So in the entire globe, there's a claim on a 1 kilometer piece of land that both, like for Jews, it's the holiest site in Judaism. For Islam, it's the third holiest site because they have Mecca and Medina. And the Palestinian Jewish conflict, they're also like, who's going to control this 1 kilometer piece of land amongst everything else? So it's a real estate problem. I mean, in really basic terms, both sides claiming the same piece of real estate. So the British back in the 1930s. British are like, we're getting out. Let's split the land. They can't come to a compromise. The Jews are like, we'll take whatever we can get. The Arabs are like, you get nothing. Okay. The Brits are like, we're out of here. Let's give this to the UN. There's this new organization called the UN. The UN's like, cool. Let's make a split. This is where the Jews live. This is where the Arabs live. What do we think, guys? Jews are like, cool. We'll take this piece of land. We just came out of the Holocaust.
They're happy with anything at this point, right? I mean, they're just like, thank
We're
God.
alive. Some of us are still alive. We'll take it. The Arabs are like, no. And by the way, like all these extra Jews just came post-Holocaust that joined the Jews that were already there. And that's something we should make known. Like as we talk about indigenous people and colonialism, Jews have been there for 3,000 years. Palestinians, Arabs have been there also plus millennia. They're both indigenous to the land. So like, let's clarify that.
Yeah, because I do see a lot of people saying, and that Jews are ethno-cleansing, or
Correct.
right? And it's like, well, but Jews are kind of Arab also, right? Like, isn't it?
They're Semitic. What is that? They're Semitic. Arabs
Right.
are Semitic. Jews are Semitic. Both Hebrew and Arabic derive from Aramaic, the language of Jesus back in the day. Literally, like King David, there was a kingdom of Israel, Jewish kingdom, like 2,500 years ago on the land. So as far as indigenousness, both peoples.
Israel is in the Middle East, so like Israelis are Middle Eastern. I know that they maybe don't call themselves Arabs, but like, aren't they?
No. They're one of the Semitic peoples. There's Turks, there's Persians, there's Arabs. Arabs are originally from Arabia, and the Gulf.
See, thank God I'm talking to you. I don't know. I didn't know this.
So for example, how did the Arab world expand? The Arabs, with Muhammad, starting in the 8th century, expanded. They expanded Islam. Islam comes out of the late 600s in Saudi Arabia, and then they expand, right? All the way to Spain, all the way to Yugoslavia, all the way, to Pakistan. The Arabs were colonizing too.
Yes.
If you, at any point in history, the Middle East has been colonized by like several hundred peoples. The Egyptians, the Phoenicians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Arabs, the Crusades. Like,
it's a lot more complicated than a meme that people can post on Instagram.
well, Leah, you know that life can be simplified by a cartoon meme. So, needless to say, just to set up the table here. So the UN says, let's split the land. Jews are like, sure. Arabs are like, absolutely not. Palestinians are like, what's going on here? These are the people who live the land. Arab countries around them, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Egypt's like, Palestinians, you don't worry. We will take care of these Jews for you. You will get the whole piece of land. We have our first big war in 1948. Israel wins. Israel holds its own, expands a little bit. What happens? Well, the West Bank and Gaza become these territories controlled by Egypt and Jordan, respectively. The Arabs are like, don't worry, people. We will take care of the Jews next time. In 1956, they try again. Nope. In 1967, they try again. Nope. In 1973, they try again. Nope. So at that point, the Palestinians become frustrated. And so you see the development of the PLO.
Hold on. Why are they losing all these wars?
They're really bad. The Arab militaries are not, they have bad strategy.
Okay.
Terrible strategy.
By this time, was the U.S. giving money to Israel to help them at this point? Or because I hear that a lot too, that we've been helping Israel.
The aid really begins after the 1967 war.
They won these wars without any help from the U.S.
Minimal, right? Mm-hmm. The 1948 war, the Israelis had to buy old Nazi planes. Ironically, the Jews are buying old Nazi planes, smuggling them into the region. By 1967 and 1973, the French have a deal with the Israelis. The Israelis have to find ways around. Now, U.S. aid begins slightly, but remember, we depend on the Middle East for oil, the Arab countries for oil. And so the Arabs are like, if you help Israel, no oil for you. And this is before we really, had the oil that we have today in the U.S. And so that made it difficult. And so there were times during the Nixon administration when the Israelis are like, President Nixon, please give us stuff. And Nixon's like, absolutely not. I can't afford an issue with the Arabs. And so that became one of the challenges they faced in the 60s and 70s. But the real military support for Israel really begins in the late 70s.
Okay. I was wondering that. Thank you.
And so what happens is the Palestinian civilians are screwed over by these Arab countries that seek to represent them, but are completely incompetent. They get frustrated. This guy named Yasser Arafat starts the Palestine Liberation Organization. And he wants to seek attention for the Palestinian cause. Well, he decides to do it through terrorism, tries to do it through hijacking planes, get some attention because he feels like he's not getting attention. And in the region, he starts bopping around and says, you know what, maybe we should take over Jordan. He actually starts a civil war in Jordan, tries to kill the king. The Israelis actually help the Jordanians fight the Palestinians. This is really the Cliff's Notes version of the conflict. In the meantime, you have these Palestinians. Go ahead.
That was in the 80s or the 90s?
That was in the 70s, 71. There's a something you could Google called Black September. It's the Palestinian attempt to take over Jordan.
Okay.
Jordan borders Palestine. It was all one British colony, and today 50 to 70% of the Jordanian population is Palestinian. They're a majority of that country, but they don't have rights in that kingdom. And so they push out the Palestinians. Palestinians then go to Lebanon. They're like, maybe we take over Lebanon. They create a civil war in Lebanon. Lebanon has had several decades of civil war, partially started by the Palestinian Liberation Organization showing up there in the 1970s. So this is what the PLO is up to. Meanwhile, the Palestinian people in the West Bank and Gaza are living under Israeli rule, right? Which they continue to do in some cases, in certain parts, today. So for them, this is decades long. They've been given all these promises. The Arab countries are going to give them a country. The UN's going to give them a country. The PLO is going to help to get them a country. And multi-generational now, we're going on 5 or 6 generations, the Palestinian people are like, where is our country? And they've been screwed over by terrible leadership. Now, the aforementioned Arafat, at some point, decides terrorism ain't doing enough. Let's start peace talks. The Israelis come to him and they're like, you've represented these people for a long time. Can you put down your gun and become a peace, somebody who can make peace, a diplomat? And they signed a peace agreement in the early 90s with the vision of creating a Palestine and Israel side by side. 30 years later, we don't have it.
Wow. So what about Palestinians living under Israeli rule or law? So why does Israel, because I've also heard from people that say Palestinians are treated in Israeli hospitals by Israeli doctors.
That's true. Including, by the way, the mastermind of the terror attack. He got cancer treatment in an Israeli hospital. Sinwar.
What? Why?
Okay, so Israel has, been a country since 1948. When all these wars happen, peoples move around, they're forced out, they're told to leave, that they're going to come back, etc. Well, where are we today? Israel's a country of about 10 million people, 1.5 million of which are Palestinians who live as full Israeli citizens. They're lawyers, they're doctors, they serve in parliament, they have their own political parties. One serves on the Supreme Court of Israel.
Wow.
They're part of Israeli society. Now, Israel, like the US, like many countries, has endemic racism, right? They certainly deal with challenges in terms of funding and schools, etc., challenges that a lot of Western countries have with minority groups. But they are full citizens, and those are the Palestinian citizens of Israel. Then you have the Palestinians who live in the West Bank and Gaza, the territories.
To me, it's also weird that the West Bank and Gaza are on separate, they're on other sides of each other. Wouldn't they all want to be next to each other? Or how did
if you were working at the UN in 1947, Leah, you would have drawn a map, as they did, that would have connected, here's a contiguous Palestine and here's a contiguous Israel. During those peace talks, by the way, in the 90s, they talked about building a highway tunnel or a bridge that would connect the two territories. So there'd be, a consistent Palestine and a consistent Israel.
Yeah,
it didn't happen. It never happened.
Each other, or that doesn't make any sense to me. But so the Palestinians that are living in West Bank and Gaza, most of these people are probably not. I don't think that they are supporting Hamas or want innocent.
It depends on who you ask.
I don't know. Right. It's it doesn't seem like Hamas is a very good leadership.
No.
So,
No, like many countries in the world, sometimes you have a couple choices and you don't like either of the choices, but someone's got to rule. We might be familiar with that here in America. Amongst the Palestinians, you had this guy Arafat who made the peace deal, gradually given more authority, more land, etc. And so they created this thing called the Palestinian Authority. And the idea was, as America ideally walks in, you're going to have a democracy, you're going to have elections. The Palestinian people are going to vote in who they want to be in charge. Well, the Palestinian Authority has held only a couple elections of questionable fairness, and they haven't had one in 15 years. Why? They're inept, they're corrupt. The vast majority of the Palestinian people think they're completely useless. If you think our leadership is old, Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian Authority president, he's 88 years old.
Wow.
And he hasn't had an election in 15 years because he knows if there's an election, if you look at polling among Palestinians, Hamas will beat him in the election. And that is what happened in the Gaza Strip about 18 years ago. The Israelis pull out of the Gaza Strip. This is the 7-mile by 25-mile piece of land that we're focused on right now. There's 2.5 million Palestinians there. They had an election. Hamas won a good majority in the legislature there. 2 years later, they basically launch a military coup, murder several hundred Palestinian Authority government leaders, and take it completely over. So Abbas, who still controls the West Bank, is like, yeah, I'm not going to do an election again because it didn't work out in Gaza.
I feel like we have listening to this, I'm like, we have no problems here.
Well, but to get to your question about the Palestinian people voted Hamas because they're like, okay, we like what they stand for in the 2005 election. Then they got a coup. Now they have no choice. And so they basically have to be subjected to Hamas's let's do war every 18 months with the Israelis that really hurt the people. So the people, there are some certainly part of the Hamas government, some who sympathize with Hamas's strategy saying, you know what, violence is the only way to achieve our ends here. But there's a whole bunch of people who are like, can you stop with the fucking war every 18 months, Hamas? It's really not good. And I keep losing family members and it makes me stuck in Gaza.
Right. And these people obviously then have to be casualties of war and their families.
These Palestinian civilians who've been waiting 5 generations for a country and everyone keeps failing them.
Right.
Now are subjected to yet another war.
Yeah.
And that's why, Leah, if you've been following the headlines, the Israelis were calling on the Palestinians to move 1 million people south. Said, clear out northern Gaza. You might have seen this headline.
Yes, I did.
So they're saying do this because we're going to take over Gaza City, the Israelis say, because Hamas is headquartered there, and we got to take out this terror group that murdered a bunch of Israelis. And we don't want to hurt civilians. So all the civilians, please get out so we can just fight mano a mano against the terrorists. For Palestinians, it's a multi-generational trauma because for them, they keep moving and they don't know whether they can go back home, right? In 48, they were told to leave or forced to leave. In 67, they were told to leave or forced to leave. So for them, their family story is about leaving home and never being able to come back. So that's why things are not as simplistic as just evacuate and you'll go home. They're like, will I go home? Will I be able to come back to this place? They don't trust anybody.
That makes sense. Now, this conflict, what you're telling me, there's horrible conflicts and wars that are going on all over the world right now that you just don't hear that much about, right? Why?
There's dozens.
Of course, right? I don't even know. I know Ukraine and Russia, but I'm sure there's many more in other countries.
There's Azerbaijan and Armenia right now. There's a conflict in Kashmir. There's about 11 happening in Africa right now.
Right. So with horrible things happening to people.
Terrible.
Why is America so invested in this war and in this conflict and in these two people's plights?
So my theory is on multiple levels here. Number one, we're a pretty religious country. This is the backdrop of the Bible. This is where the Bible takes place. Mm-hmm. So there's a resonance when it comes to religion that we're all familiar with. Americans are not very well-traveled people compared to many people around the world. But if you asked Americans, to name places around the world, Jerusalem is a place that I've heard of Jerusalem. Yeah. I've heard of Nazareth. I've heard of Bethlehem. I've heard of Israel. Now, they couldn't say the same thing for Niger or Guyana or Kashmir, but they can say that for that. So there's a religious connection that everybody has. I would also say this, because of the way modern history has gone and there's been so many conflicts in the region, the media has operated out of that place for a very long time. When, like, I worked at CBS News, I worked at Fox News, I worked at Bloomberg. Most American news organizations will have an office in London, some office in Asia, and Jerusalem or Tel Aviv is the Middle East headquarters for most media organizations. What does it mean? Well, when you have a reporter somewhere, the reporter wants to get on TV, they want to write stories. So you will see more stories about the places they're based. So as far as your media consumption, you've been consuming more stories about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict because most media organizations have had a reporter there for the better part of 80 years. So there's the religious connection, there's more media attention. And so with more media attention and religious connection, you tend to start to develop opinions. You know, that's so interesting, I think, Leah. I'm sure you've noticed this too. Like, there are people who don't have opinions on many things in the world, but they all have an opinion about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Yeah, they do. Or a lot of people, I felt like, didn't really like post anything when the Israelis were like murdered, but then they, once like Israel like kind of started engaging in war against you know, the Palestinian people, or against Hamas, I should say. But I thought that was kind of interesting because people were so quick. Or actually, this is what I saw. The day that the attacks happened, that Saturday, I started seeing people posting like, you're going to hear about Israel today, but you need to know, like, making excuses already. And I'm like, let's just like grieve these people and like let them, I mean, their bodies aren't even cold yet. And you're already saying there was less empathy for the number of Jews.
Yeah.
Other people.
I mean, I also think we live in an era where there's a tendency to be like, all right, who's the victim? Who's the good guy? Who's the bad guy? Exactly. And when something fights the narrative that's in your mind, you need to find a way to resolve it. And so you're like, well, they did that because, well, hold on one second. Like, also, not every reaction, if you feel that a certain party is being mistreated, it doesn't open the door to, and now some activists will say yes, to every single type of reaction on earth, right? Like, if you feel like you're, you know, not being treated fairly, does that give you the right to do what, right? Like, what is the line? And I feel like some people are like, there is no line when you're fighting, you know, and you've seen it, by the way, here in the US, Leah, with like the fallout of the George Floyd situation, that suddenly people feel like, you know, if people aren't being heard, they have a right to loot. Since when?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
You have a right to do it because you're not getting your voice heard. And at least now people are paying attention. And if it takes breaking into Nordstrom's and whatever, then
yeah.
And I feel like there is a bent of activists that now believe that, and they are basically projecting that onto the Middle East.
That seems like what is happening. I mean, even like I don't understand the connection between like BLM, and I'm sure that not every single BLM like activist, well, I don't know, but I mean, maybe, but I'm sure.
Well, no, I don't think we should paint anyone with a brush like that. Like, I think there's a lot of nuance, right?
Yes, but like to see that like a lot of the BLM chapters, or whoever's in charge of their social media, I should say, posted a paraglider. You know, it's one thing to say, I am completely against this war and I'm actually standing with the Palestinians because I'm choosing a side. Yeah. That's one thing. I respect that, and okay. But to use a depiction of a paraglider that actually paraglided and into a fucking music festival and killed a bunch of teenagers is like a sick way to express your solidarity. Can you do it in a different way? Like, you know, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. It's the whole ends justify the means. So like for them, they're like, they've waited long enough. They get to do whatever they want to do at this point. And does that include the murder of children? Does that include the kidnapping of the elderly? Like, is that, I mean, by the way, like, as somebody who's covered this region for a very long time, and if you believe intently that Palestinians have a right to their own country and their own land and freedom. I will say this, and maybe I'm even being conservative here. The Hamas attack less than 2 weeks ago probably set back the Palestinian cause, by 10 to 20 years.
1000%. Okay, so when people were like, when I saw that happen, I was like, oh shit. And I'm talking to all my Jewish friends and my Israeli friends, and it's like, this is going to be an all-out like war now.
Yeah.
It's like war. And I'm like, why are there people celebrating in the street, like Arab people, when like now a lot of innocent like civilians are going to die?
They're not being thoughtful, and they're taking pleasure in revenge, and not thinking strategically about what this actually might mean.
Like, there is no reason to celebrate. There is no reason to, anything like that. And
I'll tell you this, Leah, and I imagine people in your life like this, people who were like genuinely leftists, who wanted to compromise with the Palestinians inside Israel, have zero interest in that right now. By the way, many of the people they murdered who lived on the border there in those border towns, those were the liberals. Those are the peaceniks. Those are the people who want to live alongside the Palestinians, and they're the ones that were murdered.
Oh, what the fuck? That is some sick shit. Also, yeah, I mean, on Instagram, like definitely like my like really like liberal Jewish friends, not all of them, but some of them that were like, like not posting anything in the last conflict. Now they're like reposting like, like Republican stuff. Like I'm like, shit, they turned like, this is definitely like a line in the sand for a lot of people, I think.
And I want to get back to one of your first questions. You asked like why Hamas went this far. Because this is Hamas's goal. Hamas doesn't want a peace agreement. They don't want a two-state solution. They want a one-state solution, a Palestinian state and all the Jews gone, right? It's literally written into their charter. So their goal, by doing something so beyond the pale, so egregious, was to permanently poison the water for any compromise between Palestinians and Israelis.
Okay, so I listened to Ezra Klein's podcast. It was only like a 10-minute thing, and he talked about like Israel is giving Hamas like what they want, and it was interesting. And is there any way that? And then I saw that like the U.S. is maybe going to give $10 billion to Israel, which I'm like, what about healthcare? what about people here? Love my Israeli friends and all, but like, wow.
Yeah.
I'm just going to quickly go back.
Wait, hold on, but I want to give the listeners context there. So the average annual budget for the U.S. is $6 trillion. So just for perspective here.
That's a problem too for me. I'm like, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not saying that like that's, I mean, like.
Yeah. So we have an annual budget of 6 to 7 trillion. 3 trillion goes to Social Security and Medicare. 1 trillion goes to the Pentagon. And then the final 2 trillion gets spent on everything else. Of foreign aid budget, we typically spend about 100 billion a year on the rest of the world. So just like 2%, less than 2% of our budget on the rest. Now, Ukraine has increased that. But I just want to give people perspective that we should and can, as the richest country in the world, be able to do all of the above. And by the way, we spend more on healthcare in America than any other developed country. And yet it's not very good.
When I went to the Dominican Republic a couple years ago, my daughter and her friend got COVID, and we went to, they had to get quarantined. We went to the local ER, blah, 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 whatever. And when I got back, people were like, oh my God, how was that? It must have been like horrible. It's like the Dominican Republic. I'm like, it was amazing. Yeah. It was amazing. Amazing doctors, amazing medicine. They had an antiviral there that we didn't have here. My daughter and her friend tested negative for COVID 2 days later after taking this antiviral. Okay. And it was wonderful. It was wonderful. It was cheap. It was wonderful doctors, amazing people. And, that's that. Anyway,
I was in Bali on a motorbike accident. Not too bad, but like, messed up my arm or whatever. Went to a clinic, paid $7. They took care of me, and that was it.
So, I know that's a whole other conversation, but the other thing I was going to say is that, and I know everything is different, and the Ukraine-Russia situation is different too, but I felt like a lot of people were down for war that are now like anti-war. A lot of people are like, hell yeah, like Ukraine, like
war is a drug.
It's like, really, like, what's happening?
Listen, I think that also look at, I think the 9/11, you brought up 9/11. For Israelis, 10/7 was 9/11. The death of 1,400 Israelis in a country of 9 million. Leah, that'd be like if we lost 35 or 40,000 people in America. So there are many people, whether it's the Ezra Klein podcast, et cetera, say like, well, Israel's falling into a trap with Hamas here. Try to put yourself back in September, October of 2001.
Oh, I was like, go get them. Go
get them. Go get them. Now, add to that, they were in Afghanistan, half a world away. Hamas is on the border. It'd be like if Al-Qaeda had was controlling a piece of territory on the Mexico border, like on the Rio Grande with El Paso, launching rockets into Texas. Again, I'm giving you the Israeli perspective. They just went across the border and murdered 35,000 Americans in Texas. And Israel's like, okay, we're going to go across the border and eliminate these guys. And the rest of the world is saying, America, are you worried about the people who live there? America, what are you doing about these people? And they're like, whoa, they just freaking did a crazy terrorist attack on us. And that is the situation for Israel from their perspective.
Thank you. That is an amazing point that you just made. Absolutely. Why does the social justice movement hate Jewish people so much?
I mean, listen, people have asked me the origins of anti-Semitism a lot.
Right.
But welcome to the tribe, Leah. So Judaism, our calendar officially is in the 5,700 something. We've been around for, that long, we believe. And anti-Semitism, starts very early on. And I'll give you a quick history. The reason why they hate us, we have to go back. Why they hate us the first? Well, we're the first monotheistic religion. Everyone else had a million gods, right? This is the statue, the god of this, the god of that. And Jews are like, no, our God is invisible. There's one. It's up in the sky. Everyone's like, what the hell is that? That's crazy. We're going to kill you, force you to convert to our religions. Okay. So that's like the first 1,500 years of anti-Semitism. Then we get to Jesus, a Jew, right? Who, a group around him said, no, he's the Son of God, and, he's the Messiah. And so Christianity starts with its origins in Judaism, right? I joke with people, it's like the Jews' Sabbath is Saturday. So the Christians were like, what do we got? We'll go with Sunday. Who comes after that? The Muslims. We'll take Friday.
Great. Well, I say, I always say that, I say that my family is Jewish. They don't, but I'm like, you guys are Catholic, and that came from a Jewish person. So I know it's not the same. Catholicism was born out of Judaism. So
Christianity is born out of Judaism, right? The Old Testament, the Torah.
Exactly.
Then there's a New Testament. The Jews are like, we're cool with the Old Testament. The Christians are like, well, we have this New Testament. Okay. For a while there, they're figuring out what to do. If you look into early Christianity, it's a fascinating kind of like Uber versus Lyft situation happening, because they're trying to distinguish what they're selling versus the Jews. So we're going to drop the kosher thing. We're going to drop the circumcision thing. And we'll take, our holy day Sunday, et cetera. And then finally you get to the point where the Roman Empire declares Christianity the religion. And now the Jews haven't accepted Jesus. And the Jews kill Jesus. The blood libel begins. That the reason why Jesus was killed is because of the Jews. And that explains a good 1,500 to 2,000 years of anti-Semitism. That the Jews won't accept Jesus. And so you have things like the Crusades. You have things like the Inquisition in 1492 in Spain, where they're like, Jews convert, accept Jesus. And so that explains that for a long time. Then anti-Semitism, why do they hate the Jews? Well, the Jews are the lowest rungs of society. They're bringing us down. This is an argument you saw Hitler make. They're communists, and they're the lowest rung of society, and they're below us. Then you have others who are like, these Jews, they got to do money lending because it, was not acceptable in the Quran or the Christian Bible. So the Jews are suddenly getting rich. Why are they so rich? They're the elites deciding things behind the scenes. So if you look at the history of anti-Semitism, it was like, well, they don't believe in our gods. They killed Jesus. They're the lowest rung of society. They're the commies. Actually, they're the capitalists. They're the highest rung of society, and they're having secret meetings about us. So over time, the only unifying thing is the Jews suck and are a problem, but everyone has a different theory as to why the Jews are terrible, as to why they're anti-Semitic. Now, after being the lowest rung, the Jews are the elites. So these social justice warriors believe these Jewish elites are bringing down the little guy. And that's an interesting issue here when you talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because the Jews were initially the underdogs against these Arab armies, 300 million Arabs, a couple million Jews, and then it flips. And the Jews are the aggressors, and the Palestinians are the victims. And I think for a lot of social justice people, you side with the perceived victims, the people who are perceived as being hurt. And, the Jews are the man in the Middle East. But that's not the way the Israelis see it.
Of course not. They're surrounded by a bunch of countries that want to murder them and don't want them there. How are they the oppressor? I don't understand.
It all depends. I mean, it's like if you're taking a picture, the lens. If you zoom in really closely, you see the Jews as an aggressor. You see the Israelis as an aggressor in the West Bank and Gaza. If you zoom out to the entire region, you see Iran saying death to Israel, you're a cancer, we're going to eliminate you. You see Hezbollah in Lebanon saying death to Israel, we're going to eliminate you. You see, you zoom out to the region, and the Israelis are like, we're surrounded by several hundred million Arabs. What are you talking about? We're the victims. We're the small guy. And, it really depends on your aperture and how zoomed in you are.
That's so interesting. How do you think, can you give your, how is this what's going to happen over the next couple of weeks? What do you think? And you're like,
I try to not get too much in the prediction game, but I'll tell people, here are the things to be on the lookout for when this podcast comes out. Keep in mind, by the way, as we speak here, Leah, things are fast moving in the situation.
Right now, right.
We just watched this whole hospital thing unfold in the past 36 hours, and that had 3 storylines to it in 36 hours. Here are a couple things. Number one, there's more than 200 hostages being kept in the Gaza Strip.
How do we know that?
The Israelis have figured out over the last 2 weeks who's dead and who's missing. And that's also one of the reasons why, whenever you see casualty counts very quickly after an explosion, you're like, whoa, where's that number coming from? The Israelis literally, even when we saw in Lahaina in Maui with the fire, how long did it take us to count the bodies, to figure out the missing versus the dead? It takes a while, which is one of the reasons I gave people, take a couple grains of salt from Hamas where they declared 500 dead at a hospital within 3 minutes. You're you can't even count to 500 in that time.
How do we know that these Israeli hostages, how do we know they're alive? How do we know?
We don't know. Now, even as we speak, just saw a couple headlines that a couple people they thought were being held hostage, they found their bodies recently. Also, Hamas burnt several hundred bodies. They're having trouble identifying remains right now. And in some cases, you need DNA from family, but when they killed entire families and they're all burned, they're having trouble. This is the sick thing right now that you're dealing with over there.
I don't believe it. People are like, they didn't behead. They only why are we fighting over beheading?
Why does it matter how innocent people were murdered? Doesn't matter. Why are we, parsing that, right? Innocent people were murdered in a sick way, but whether they were, what body parts they have left and how, whether, I won't talk about it further, but it doesn't matter. Okay. Now I will say, the Israelis have figured out that this is how many hostages they have missing, how many people are missing right now. And we haven't been able to find them within Israel. Israel's a small country, and so they have a certain number of bodies. They figured that out. And right now they believe the count is at 203. It was at 199. So, it's pretty nuanced. Hamas has released hostage videos of several of the hostages that they've been able to confirm are being held hostage, including the babies, the 9-month-old. Hamas put out the video to say, hey, look, we're taking care of babies. Look at how nice we are. And it's you're not the babysitter. You stole them from their families. So for Israel, priority number one that everyone should be watching for, what happens with the hostages? Many of these hostages, by the way, either dual citizens or citizens of other country. Thailand, Nepal, France, England, Germany, the US, Canada are among 24 countries that have foreign nationals being held hostage by the terror group in Gaza. What happens there? Storyline number one. Huh?
People are saying ceasefire. The objective should be get the hostages, right?
And so Israel has said, you want, Hamas, you want to begin conversation? Release 200 people and let's have a conversation. Now, Hamas sees it as a bargaining chip. There's about 6,000 Palestinians held in Israeli prisons for various crimes, including murder, including a lot of Hamas fighters, and they want to bargain the civilians, the hostages, for their soldiers and for the prisoners.
Like, get rid of them, give them back.
So, but then now let me take you back to 9/11. Do you negotiate with terrorists, Leah? They just came and murdered a bunch of people, and now we're going to negotiate with Osama bin Laden. That's the way the Israelis see it. And so the hostages are number one. Number two, Hamas, the terrorist group. It's been leading Gaza for 15 years. The Israelis say we're going to eliminate them. What does that mean? What does elimination mean? Who runs that place afterwards? That's another thing to watch for. How do they get rid of them? Do they do a full invasion? Now, it's a small piece of land, but they have hundreds of miles of intricate tunnels. One of the reasons Gaza is what it is because Hamas spends all the money building tunnels for their weapons. Okay, that's the infrastructure. You know, people say there's no shelters in Gaza. There are shelters. There are tunnels. They're not allowed to be used by civilians. They're only allowed to be used by the soldiers. They were built by the Hamas terrorists for their own purposes. By the way, many of the hostages are believed to be kept down there. So how does Israel go in there and deal with urban warfare? And what is the casualty count, both on the Israeli side and the Palestinian side, in the coming weeks? Because as the Palestinian toll goes up, that will increase pressure on the Israelis to end the operation. And that's something to be watching as well.
Okay. Wow. Well, I could talk to you for hours and hours about this. But seriously, I learned so much. I hope my listeners learned a lot too, because, you know, I feel like we're all learning from Instagram.
Yeah, I mean, guys, like the one thing I'll say is, and this is something I've like posted a couple times. And by the way, you can like find our 24/7 coverage on our Instagram handle at Mosheh, at MOSHEH.
Follow him.
If anyone tells you this is simple, it's not. If anyone tells you like it presents 3 cartoons as a meme on Instagram to explain the conflict, they're doing you a disservice. It's an immensely complex conflict. And when you throw out terminology like apartheid and genocide and ethnic cleansing, those are very charged terms. They've happened in human history. They're, in this context, they're being used inappropriately. And maybe that's for part 2 of a conversation at some point, Leo. But there's a lot of charged terms thrown out there. And I think what would behoove everybody is to say, you know what, I need to learn a bit more about the history here. I understand that, let's learn who the main characters are. And then go to the basics, which is there's 200 hostages being held against their will. Then you have 2.5 million Palestinian civilians who are unfortunately living under a terrorist regime. And it's the same way I would say you could feel about the North Korean people, the Iranian people, the Russian people, the Cuban people. You know, they're living under a regime that doesn't really care about them, doesn't care about their interests.
Can you touch on the genocide, the ethnic cleansing, the apartheid? Like these are the, like, is that going to take too long? Do you have to go? I mean, because it's
we can do a couple of these. All right, so what is genocide? The deliberate killing of a large number of people of one ethnic group with the aim of destroying that nation. Okay, that's genocide.
Okay, so it sounds like it sounds like Hamas is trying to create a genocide of Israelis.
If you look at the charter of Hamas, their goal is the deliberate killing of the Jews on the land. They want all the Jews gone. Okay. What is happening in Gaza is a war. If you look at the definition of genocide or ethnic cleansing, that is not what is happening. The Israeli intention here is not to destroy the Palestinian people and kill all of them. In fact, the Palestinian population has doubled in the past 20 years in the West Bank and Gaza. Gaza 20 years ago had 1 million people. Today, that's 2.5 million people. So the Israelis joke, they're like, if we're ethnic cleansing or genocide, we're like really bad at it. Like the population has doubled. Now, that's not to say the Palestinians who live there have equal rights, have opportunity, but at the same time, it's a misnomer to call what is happening in Gaza genocide or ethnic cleansing at this juncture. It's war. What is happening there is war, and war is ugly and war is terrible. It also is a disservice to genocides past if we're going to call everything a genocide. Okay, like Rwanda was a genocide. What the Turks did to the Armenians a century ago was genocide. The Holocaust was a genocide. If we're talking about the deliberate killing or something bad happening to a large group of Muslims, you know where that's happening right now? China, to the Uyghur Muslims. It's not happening in Gaza right now. The Palestinians, again, suffer from not equal rights. They deserve a nation. The Israelis have tried to ignore the issue. The Israelis have, at times, mistreated them. But it's ethnic cleansing, genocide. Let's put those aside for a second. Like, it's just not that it's inaccurate to say that that's happening. Apartheid, that term, is a much more charged and complex term here. So, do we have a moment to discuss it? All right.
Please.
So let's talk about apartheid. Where does the term come from? It was initially used to describe the system that South Africa had for several decades, the apartheid system, that gave special rights to the white minorities over the black majority in South Africa. Mm-hmm. If you know a little bit about history, Nelson Mandela comes about, and apartheid ends in the early 90s in South Africa. South Africa, by the way, is still dealing with the fallout from that system that existed for many, many decades. Apartheid was specific to South Africa until the late 90s, when people said, this term could be used to describe other types of situations. So what is it exactly? It's a system of segregation or discrimination on the grounds of race. Here in the US for many years, whether it was, slavery especially, but post-slavery, could you describe it as a system of apartheid? Most certainly. Now, do some black activists today still describe? Yeah, I mean, there's versions of it, but it's not like organized discrimination, segregation. When it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, again, there's nuance here. Within Israel proper, as a country, with, again, about 10 million people, 1.5 million Palestinian citizens of Israel, they have equal rights, they vote, political parties, hold jobs, etc. There's funding issues, etc. Like I talked about earlier, some of the same issues the Muslim population in France deals with, or blacks or other minority groups, Latinos deal with in the US. But those Palestinians, certainly it would be inaccurate to call it apartheid within Israel proper. Okay, so now what's left? Gaza and the West Bank, the 5 million Palestinians who live there. Gaza has been governed by Hamas for 16 years. Now, Israel controls the border, so does Egypt. And it so happens that when a terrorist group runs a piece of territory, the people are going to suffer because the world is not going to generally be very open. Now, Israel, up until the terror attacks, was allowing in 20,000 Palestinians to work inside Israel, and we're ready to increase that number. They're actually negotiating with Hamas to continue, because they thought Hamas, like, oh, you want your people to work? Like, maybe you're going to become a responsible governing entity. Is it accurate to call it apartheid there, since Hamas is the governing authority, but the borders are shut off? I don't know. Now you have the West Bank. Now, in the West Bank, this is a situation where the Palestinians control some of the territory, like the city of Ramallah, for example, the city of Bethlehem, for example. But there are other parts of the Palestinian territories that are completely governed by the Israeli military. Again, the Israelis, it's based on their security concerns. The terror attacks emanate from those places. And so the Israelis, effectively has Israeli military rule. You cannot move from town to town, or there's checkpoints. It is a separate, if you're a Palestinian who lives out in the West Bank, or you're a Jew who lives out in the West Bank, there are two systems in place. Now, the Israelis would say apartheid, by definition, is if we declared the West Bank all of Israel and we were treating the Palestinians who lived in the West Bank as second-class citizens as part of the country. The Israelis are like, this is all temporary. We don't plan to hold this land forever. So you could, in essence, say that the treatment of the Palestinians in the West Bank looks like apartheid, but is not intended as a permanent apartheid system, because the intention is to negotiate a permanent settlement with the Palestinians and create a Palestine there. But for the Palestinians who live there day to day, they'll say, well, I'm living apartheid. Yesterday, I lived apartheid in the city of Nablus, the city of Jenin. And the Israelis would say, by definition, that's not the case. And so you've seen, groups like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, various UN agencies say, in effect, that is apartheid in the West Bank right now. The Israelis say that is a misnomer because we don't intend to keep the place forever. We're just waiting for a responsible Palestinian leader to make an agreement with. Does that make sense?
Yes, totally. So Palestinians have, they're in charge of Bethlehem?
Ramallah, Bethlehem. If you look at the West Bank, it looks like a kidney bean. Okay. Mm-hmm. And it's called the West Bank, even though it's on the east side of Israel, because it's the West Bank of the Jordan River. And it looks like a kidney bean. Jerusalem's in the middle. And then there's all these little towns in there. Palestinian towns and Jewish towns. There's about 4 million plus Palestinians who live there. There's about 600,000 Israelis who now live there. And if you hear the term settlements, the Israelis have towns there that they've built over the past 50 years since they've controlled that piece of territory coming out of the 67 war, and they've expanded. And for the Palestinians, they're like, well, as you expand, this is our future country, but you keep taking up more square footage in this country. And so based on the peace agreements of the 90s and 2000s, the way the West Bank works, if you looked at maps, is just like scattered everywhere. Like Palestinians control this dot, Jews control this dot, Palestinians control this dot, Jews control this Palestinian dot. This is a cooperative dot between the Palestinians and the Jews. It is a mess of a place.
So are tourists allowed to go to Bethlehem?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. I mean,
it's a major part of the economy there, actually.
That's what I would think. I mean, I went to Israel back in like 2013, I think, and I didn't go to Bethlehem, but I went to Jerusalem. Yeah.
No, you would have remembered, because going to Bethlehem, you're effectively entering another country. So there's checkpoints, there's passport checks, there's a whole bunch of stuff.
I mean, I went through a bunch of checkpoints, and not a bunch, but like some, it's a very interesting place.
It's unfortunately 80 years of conflict. And this is the thing, it's like, for the Palestinians are like, we're waiting for our country. And the Israelis are like, well, you've said no to a bunch of deals and history has passed you by. And that's the sad part that we deal with here, is that things change over time, right? Like we're several generations into this now. And so, even like, the idea of how many refugees are there? Well, the UN has changed the definition of what a refugee is for the Palestinians. Typically, you're a refugee if you leave a country, like the Ukrainians who've left the country. But like if their children are then born in Poland, they're not refugees. They're Poles. For the Palestinians, they've allowed beyond 3 generations to be calling themselves refugees. So when you see refugee camps in Gaza or the West Bank, some of those people are living in refugee camps because their great-great-grandfather was a refugee. But they're now 5 generations into living in Gaza. But they still say, my great-grandfather lived in this part of Israel, that's now Israel, and we plan to go back at some point, even though they haven't been there since 1947. So there's some of them will still hold the keys to the house they say they had.
I don't understand what people think. I even if there was like, I don't understand. Do people think that it would be amazing for Gazans or Palestinians to be like, even if Gaza was run by like a non-terrorist organization, which obviously would be better, it's pretty fucking oppressive. Not because of Israel, but because of Sharia law and like.
Right. When you have an Islamist government, it tends to be a fucking shitty place to live.
Pretty bad. It's pretty, if you're a woman, if you're gay, I mean, it's pretty.
If you're gay, you're executed. I mean, that's why I like seeing like, some of the interesting activists out there. I was like, do you know what they would do to you in Gaza?
Obviously it's not to say that like these people's lives are not as, they're just as valuable as anyone else's life. Yeah. But people to think that like the Israelis are making their lives so horrible. It's like, well, if you're a woman, you can't even divorce your husband. You'll get fucking your arms cut off. I mean,
listen, I think that Israel says, listen, like we don't want to be responsible for Gaza. We would love if Gaza, they talked about Gaza becoming the Singapore of the Middle East. It's a small piece of land. It's the size of Singapore. It's on the Mediterranean. It could have beautiful beaches. It lies between Egypt and Israel. When Israel left, when they took out all their troops and settlers in 2005, which was very difficult for Israel, they had to pull out 10,000 of their own citizens. They had their own military pulling out Israelis against their will. And they said, here, make it beautiful. And they left greenhouses. The Israelis were growing they had all this agriculture going on in the land. A bunch of American billionaires, Mort Zuckerman and others, gave a whole bunch of money. They said, make this place great. Within 18 months, Hamas controlled the place, and it's been, terrible. It's not to say that they couldn't do that again. I mean, you can see countries remake themselves. They can go in both directions.
No, I'm trying to be hopeful for these people, and
I am too. The suffering and the trauma, and we know that this trauma is carried epigenetically. So even the future children of the people suffering the current trauma will have trauma literally in their bloodstream. I mean, they've studied this, from the people who whose parents or grandparents were Holocaust survivors, that you still have trauma in your system.
Oh my God, big time.
And
Big time.
And so these traumatized people, and like the vast majority of them on both sides, want to live in peace. And yet they have suffered from terrible leadership, some worse than others. Like, I'm not here to like call everyone equal, right? And it has meant that the poor people are dragged into war over and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
And sometimes it takes like a really bad thing to wake people up or to lead to a compromise. And let's, I think hope springs eternal. Like, let's hope that like this was the most horrific terrorist attack in Israeli history. What's happening in Gaza is horrific right now. Can cooler heads prevail? Well, there's a lot of bad actors in the Middle East, Iran, etc. And I'm like you, Leah. I would like to remain optimistic as well.
Okay, I could keep going because I want to like know more about Iran, and I want to, but like we're running out of time. But
we can discuss Iran real quickly. Just
let's go. Go.
Okay, Iran.
Because they said better be careful, and now I'm like, does that mean like we're gonna get into World War III? What's going on?
Iran's another country where 90 million people live under a terrible Islamist regime. They hate the regime. We saw they attempted a revolution last year. They put down that revolution.
Taking their scarves off their heads.
Their scarves off their heads and being killed for it by this Islamist regime that took over in 1979, right? Before 79, by the way, do you know who had a great relationship with America and Israel? Iran, okay? The Shah of Iran. But then this regime takes over, and this regime also has a philosophy, not unlike Hamas's, of, global Shiite rule.
Yeah.
And Islam needs to control Israel, the land of Palestine. And so since 1979, they've declared that Israel is a cancer. The Jews need to be thrown into the sea. And we're going to pursue that as part of our strategy as a country. Okay. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to fund some terror groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, to pursue our means.
And the Hezbollah people, they wear crazy face makeup. They have like a crazy uniform looking thing, don't they?
If you think Hamas is bad, Hezbollah is like much more well-trained. Hezbollah has basically taken over. It'd be like a terror group controlling like half the country. They control like a good third of Lebanon.
What do they do? What do they in terms of a terror group? What do they do to people in Lebanon?
Well, so they also have social and humanitarian. So like when Iran gives Hezbollah money, some of it goes to Hezbollah giving to the Lebanese people to win over people, give them jobs, give them aid, create clinics, create schools. By the way, at those schools, they teach them some interesting things, right?
Right.
And so, for Iran, they want to indoctrinate the region. And this, there's a whole separate thing, Leah, about the Shiite-Sunni divide. But Iran is the home of Shia Islam. You've had that divide in Islam for the better part of 1,200 years. And for Iran, they want to dominate. And this is one of the reasons you have a conflict between Iran and Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, the home of Sunni Islam. Iran, the home of Shiite Islam. They hate each other. It's one of the reasons why the Israelis and the Saudis have gotten close, because they don't love each other, but they both hate Iran. Iran's looking for influence across the region. One of the effects of taking out Saddam Hussein in Iraq is majority Shiite. So now Iran has influence in Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon. They've expanded their reach across the region. And so they feel like they're on the upswing here. And so Iran, will fund terror groups, train terror groups, give them weapons to pursue their goals. And their goal is, global domination, but they're going to begin with regional domination.
So are we safe in the U.S.?
I hope so. I think so. Listen, I think that, we talked about the U.S. budget earlier. We spent $6 trillion a year, $1 trillion on the defense and intelligence budget. We have more weapons than any other country on earth. It's like, we're not facing like Nazi Germany. There's not like a country out there. Iran's not a country that can like eliminate the U.S. Right. Could they do terrorist attacks? Certainly. Have they? Absolutely. Do they see a purpose in doing that right now? It's unclear what the Iranian strategy is. Clearly, they're focused on Israel right now. Certainly, looking at our southern border, we do need to like watch what's happening there. Whether there's an opportunity for those groups to get people across. Iran also knows that given U.S. firepower, the U.S. could do a lot of damage to Iran very quickly. Do they have a death wish?
Okay. So just since you brought up the southern border, because I have friends who were like sending me stuff like there's like Middle Eastern like nationals and like, terrorists coming across the southern border. I'm like, how the hell did they get to Mexico? I'm like, is that just some fake news, Fox News shit trying to get people to?
No, they got there.
Oh, it's not like some lie. I thought.
Do you know that when we weren't letting in Ukrainians at the beginning of the war, do you know how they got into the U.S., Ukrainian refugees? Through Tijuana. Everyone knows you can get in. Everyone around the world knows you can get into the U.S. through the southern border.
Right.
Now, are certain people on the right and Fox News overplaying it? Absolutely. But
catch them? Are they here do they want to just come here and work and live? Or are they here to be terrorists? Like, what's the deal?
I haven't spoken to all of them. I would imagine, like most things, the vast majority of them are here to be peaceful, here to get a job. Their life sucks in the country that they're in. They're here seeking asylum. And the dream of America continues to live on for people. We in America love to criticize America, but for most of the world, they want to come to America. And so, I mean, it's common knowledge that around the world that like you go through the southern border to get into the U.S. Again, most have peaceful, goals, but certainly I'm sure there's, and we've seen it like nefarious actors, criminals who come across the border. Absolutely.
Of course. Okay. I have to go to my psychiatrist appointment, so I do have to go, or I would just keep talking to you forever and ever.
I hope I gave you some good material to discuss with her. This to me, Leah, was sort of like my therapy appointment for the day.
That's sad.
I like talking to you.
I know. I like talking to you too. Will you please come back?
Sure thing.
And can you remind people again where to find you?
Yeah, so I have a daily podcast, the Mo News Podcast. So you can find that wherever you listen to your podcast. And then my Instagram account, 24/7 coverage, Mo News, is just at MOSHEH.
Wow, you're doing amazing work, seriously. And I can't wait to have you back on.
I can't wait. Hopefully with better news, Leah. More positive news. We got to talk about Britney Spears at some point.
Next time we'll talk about Britney and Justin, for sure.
All right, sounds good.